where am I? Oh hey, good to see a friendly face. Say, do you know where we are? Nobody home. I hope they don't mind me barging in for a bit. I guess we'll be stuck here for a while. So, do you want to hear about the time I beat Borderlands 2 with only Deathtrap? Well, it all started when I got a comment. It was simple. Something along the lines of, you should try beating the game with only Gage's action skill. I read it and dismissed it at first, but it stuck in my mind. For the next few months, when I was trying to figure out what to do next, I kept thinking about it. The time I accidentally summoned Deathtrap in the Wilhelm fight. So, sometime in November of 2025, I opened a poll. The first option was Borderlands 1 grenades only. Second being Borderlands 2 action skill only. And the last was a very silly run idea that I got in a comment that I wasn't even sure made sense. Of course, the Borderlands 2 run won because people like what they like. It was clear the audience was interested, so all that was left to do was actually do the run. Before we start, obviously, only being able to use Deathtrap comes with some implications and questions that need to be answered. So let's establish the rules. Firstly, we can only damage enemies with Deathtrap, but things that Deathtrap can't target or damage for whatever reason, we can melee. Secondly, any skills that enhance Deathtrap or are activated by Deathtrap are allowed. This means everything from Upshot Robot to Shock Storm to Sharing is Caring. Lastly, I can hold a weapon to get the health regeneration from cooking up trouble, but obviously, I won't be using it for any other reason. So, to start off, we're going to need to actually be able to use Deathtrap. This means, as soon as we can, we're heading to the Fight for Sanctuary DLC. I'm going to assume you already know how this works, so I won't bother going into detail. Just know that when I get back to Claptrap's place, I'm level 5. Being at level 5 makes it rather easy for Deathtrap to deal with all of the monglets on the way to Knuckle Dragger. However, it doesn't help with the primary issue with having our only damage source being an action skill, cooldowns. By default, Deathtrap's cooldown is a whopping 60 seconds. Every time Deathtrap dies or his activity timer runs out, we will have to wait another 60 seconds before being able to summon him again. This is annoying, but for now, we'll survive. When Claptrap gets stuck, I need to summon Deathtrap to kill the Bullymongs, but there isn't enough duration in Deathtrap left to fight Knuckle Dragger. So, we wait for Deathtrap to get off cooldown, then head into the fight. Deathtrap makes short work of Knuckle Dragger and the rest of his goons, and Claptrap opens the way to Liarsburg. In Liarsburg, our damage from being overleveled is more than enough to deal with the various fauna and Bullymongs in the area. Hammerlock shows himself, and we give him Claptrap's eye, then save and quit to skip some dialogue. I turn in, cleaning up the burg, and grab This Town Ain't Big Enough. While we did come into the southern shelf overleveled, that stops being the case pretty much immediately after clearing out Liarsburg. The game more or less expects you to be at least level 7 before going to tackle Captain Flint, so we're going to need to do some legwork before progressing. After showing Mother Nature who's boss, we turn in the mission and escort Claptrap toward the bandit camps that block our way to Captain Flint. After clearing the first camp, we grab the quest, Handsome Jack here, and save and quit to get back to Liarsburg fast. We grab the 3 echoes, turn the mission in, and since we're so close to level 6, I decide to preempt the incoming issues caused by our level and head back to the Fight for Sanctuary. Then, after spending some time there, I decided it'd be easier and faster to power level in the Digistruct Peak, so I spent about 20 minutes there. I go from level 6 to level 10. I dump my 5 skill points into Mei Lin, hoping to move into Strength of 5 Gorillas. Back to the southern shelf, Deathtrap makes discount sashimi of the second bandit camp, then takes his sweet time to recharge before doing the same to Boom Boom. Claptrap takes our load to his face, and we can finally begin the ascent up the soaring dragon. Because of our extra levels, this area doesn't pose any large issues, except for when Deathtrap's duration runs out, and we're left sitting there and waiting. 60 seconds here, another 60 seconds there. It's not much of a physical challenge, but it is a challenge. This run will be a test of patience. A virtuous mission, if you will. Now, Captain Flint. Thankfully, Flint's AI is not the most sophisticated, nor does he deal much damage. So, Deathtrap is able to kill him fairly easily, so long as I do some body blocking. Thankfully, in the next few missions there isn't much that needs killing, so we're going to be mostly speeding through the game, of course, without a car. Deathtrap tries to save Corporal Reese, but unfortunately, we're too late. Reese succumbs to his wounds, but leaves us with the battery's location. After waiting another 60 seconds for Deathtrap's refractory period, we kill the Borderlands 1 Psycho and get the power core, then zero-sum to get back to Sanctuary faster. Sanctuary antics ensue, cue audience laughter. Level 10 isn't horrible for the mission Hunting the Firehawk, but I would like some more skill points to hopefully increase the effectiveness of Deathtrap and play around with different builds. So, I go back to the Destruct Peak and get to level 12, putting 1 point into Strength of 5 Gorillas and 1 point into the Stare. The Stare is one of several augment skills that gives Deathtrap a new attack and slightly changes his appearance. In particular, the Stare adds a laser attack to Deathtrap, which deals a very decent amount of fire damage and can set enemies on fire. Heading into Frostburn Canyon, we find Lilith and begin putting our new upgrades to the test. The Stare isn't particularly strong, but it's no worse than Deathtrap's normal melee attack for now. It does have one upside in that Deathtrap doesn't need to be in melee range of an enemy for the Stare to connect. After Lilith and Deathtrap take care of all my issues whilst I cower in the corner, I thank Lilith with a bunch of hard drugs, which is not too dissimilar to how I handle issues in real life. Now that we've finished hunting the Firehawk, Sanctuary is at a high enough level that we can get class mods. I spent a few minutes searching for a Roboteer class mod for bonus cooldown rate and melee damage. After that, I go to the Deathtrap Peak to just barely get me into level 13, and run over to Three Horns Valley to honk my horn. We get to the dust and meet Ellie, who tells us that cars are cringe and we need to lower the rate of car ownership in order to pass legislation for more pedestrian-friendly infrastructure. In English, Deathtrap needs to blow up some cars. This poses a particular issue for us because Deathtrap's AI insists on treating bandit technicals as melee targets rather than using the ranged shock attack, and even though Deathtrap can use the Stare, it doesn't actually damage the cars. To give myself a better chance here, I respec out of the Stare and instead put my points into the Anarchy skill tree to get Robot Rampage. It's not terribly hard to manipulate the bandit technicals into stopping completely in their tracks. There really isn't a method to do this, as far as I can tell. You kinda just have to keep running at them until their AI decides to crap out, and then you can let Deathtrap do the rest. About 5 more minutes of saving and quitting later, and we have all of the car parts needed to prove to Ellie that walkable cities are now within reach. As thanks, she builds us a replica of the cars we've been destroying until now, and we don't drive it back to Three Horns Divide. At the gate to the stronghold, we spawn the Goonmobile and honk the horn. I spawn Deathtrap to deal with all of the enemies in the area, then wait 55 seconds for Deathtrap to return from the store with milk and cigarettes. We walk into the trigger to spawn Badma and summon Deathtrap, who puts in a valiant effort, but kinda gets shit on as soon as Badma realizes who the real threat is. After another 55 seconds, we summon Deathtrap again, only for him to last barely 5 seconds. And this really highlights the primary issue with Deathtrap. Even with our basic cooldown reduction, we can only deal damage so long as Deathtrap stays alive. Against enemies we were higher level than, this wasn't a horrible issue. But against a mini-boss that's 2 levels above us, and we are practically throwing bits of metal and hoping the enemy catches tetanus on a 60-second cooldown. Several minutes later, we kill Badma and get into Bloodshot Stronghold, and let Deathtrap loose against its inhabitants. Deathtrap gets his shit pushed in, and I'm kinda stuck. There's really only one lever I can pull at this point to help get further along, and so we're back to the Digistruct Peak. I don't think I need many levels, since each level increases both Deathtrap's health and damage in equal measure, so I only get to level 14 before attempting to tackle the stronghold again. This time, we make it past the first locked section and reach the toilet room. It takes a few summons of Deathtrap to pass the second door, but we do, and I even take some time to kill Mad Mike. Since there aren't any more locked sections between us and Roland, we can practically run straight to the end, though I do take a small detour to open this large red chest and get rewarded with a new turtle shield. We meet up with Roland and he does what he does best. The Bloodshot Ramparts is a pretty funny place. When you boil it down, there really isn't anything stopping you from just heading straight to the end of the map. So that's exactly what I do, and summon Deathtrap right in Warden's face. I didn't realize this before, but for some reason, Deathtrap doesn't think constructors are a melee target, and will use his shock ranged attack instead. This is annoying. Very, very annoying. In some specific situations, Deathtrap's ranged shock attack is perfectly fine, good even. But here it would be so much better if he had access to his normal melee attacks and augments. C'est la vie. I take a couple attempts to see if different positioning or skills would get me further, and while I get about halfway through Warden's health bar, I'm not exactly thrilled about the prospect of potentially needing to wait for 3 separate summons of Deathtrap to kill him. I'm not exactly sure how long it takes before the drop barge comes in and takes Roland to the gulag, but I can only imagine it'd be close. So, back to pulling the funny XP lever. My main goal from this farming session is increasing Deathtrap's health and damage, but there's also an additional benefit from leveling up. A skill called Upshot Robot that makes it so when you get a kill, it extends Deathtrap's duration by 5 seconds and gives him a 5% melee damage increase. This skill is really weird, because while it seems powerful at first, it's only really useful if you as Gage are also killing things alongside Deathtrap. Deathtrap cannot sustain himself against strong enemies, and as a result, the gains from Upshot Robot are usually negligible in this run, but I digress. We get back to Warden and let Deathtrap get to work. Somehow Deathtrap gets under the map, which makes him practically invincible, and allows him to spam his laser attack. This brings Warden almost all the way down, but falls just short of dealing the finishing blow. 55 more seconds of corner time for me. The Warden gets macerated, parenthetical sewage, and we get back to Sanctuary to reconvene with the second best character in all of Borderlands. Roland gives us the skinny on Jack's plan, and we head to Tundra Express. We could use the big jet engine things to light the Varkids, but I decide to melee the Firemelon since it's within the rules of the challenge. After being introduced to Mordecai and Tina, we grab the Badonkadonks and get back to Tina, who is sleeping on the job. After waking her up, Deathtrap decides to help her with making the explosives, and we run off to the end of the line. Running up to the Wilhelm fight, I really was not sure what to expect. We're on level, so this might be a good fight, I thought to myself. The reality was so much worse than I could have imagined. Wilhelm, even in some of the worst challenges people have done in this game, is usually a pretty easy fight, but in most of those, people have one key thing going for them, actually being able to control their damage. Deathtrap is, in a word, dog shit. He has no methods by which to control which enemies he chooses to target, nor does he deal enough damage to actually make up for this poorly designed AI. This means we are completely at the mercy of this machine.
Kid, Wilhelm nearly killed us all in New Haven without taking a scratch.
It doesn't even end there. After bringing Wilhelm down to low enough HP, he will begin spawning a different type of surveyor, repair surveyors. Normal surveyors just add a shield to Hyperion robots, but repair surveyors actually heal them. This poses a gigantic problem for us. Even with our slightly better Roboteer class mod, it still takes about 54 seconds for Deathtrap to come off of cooldown. meaning we have to come at this fight one of two ways. The first method is winning the lottery. The idea behind this is just hoping to God Deathtrap actually decides to target the repair surveyors before Wilhelm. It's extraordinarily unlikely, and even if Deathtrap does this, it's not guaranteed that he'll be able to out DPS the health Wilhelm regenerates during Deathtrap's cooldown period. It might be possible if you leave some shield surveyors from before alive, then try to somehow manipulate Deathtrap into only attacking Wilhelm since he can outdamage the shield regeneration, but that would require a similar level of luck. Method 2 is pulling the big lever labeled XP. And honestly, this is the big problem with this run. There really is only one way to solve problems, and that is get a higher level. It's not necessarily the fault of the game. If I were using weapons like normal, there'd be a bunch of ways to utilize movement, level geometry, and skill points which could potentially benefit us. But because the run revolves around this fuck-ass robot that makes all of its own decisions, we are utterly helpless in all but the most basic strategies. And even within that, we have even fewer choices depending on if Deathtrap sees the enemy as a valid melee target. So, that's what we're going to do. But instead of going to the fight for Sanctuary or to Destruct Peak, we're going to do some simultaneous loot and XP farming in the Mercenary Day DLC. The DLC goes by pretty normal. We investigate the coal, kill some snowmen, stop some highway robbery, clear the ice, attempt some highway robbery of our own, and relight the single furnace that keeps Gingerton from freezing. Now, if we want our XP, we're going to need to take out the big boss, Tinder Snowflake. This would normally be fine, but guess which boss Deathtrap doesn't want to melee? Trick question, the answer is apparently fucking all of them. But among them, Tinder Snowflake. This run just went from kinda bad to sucks big donkey balls. I spent about 40 minutes trying to workshop a way that I can make killing Tinder Snowflake reasonable, but even after finding this decent cheese spot where I was mostly safe and could summon Deathtrap over and over again, it took 20 minutes to get Tinder Snowflake to about 2/3 of his health bar, and I died to the red gas attack. So, this plan is bust, and that means we're heading back to the peak. I spent some time getting some XP there before moving to fight for Sanctuary for a bit, and ultimately deciding that instead of just doing these mindless farms, I'd go do some missions in the base game. The first mission I do is No Vacancy, which is the quest to power up the Happy Pig Motel. Next, I make use of the newly acquired fast travel station and grab Assassinate the Assassins. We kill Watt, Wunny, Wreath, and Roof, and return to Sanctuary. The XP rewards from the enemies in these missions aren't great, but the missions themselves give half decent XP, nearly getting us to level 18. Thinking that I could make up the difference on the way, I head back to the end of the line through Tundra Express. We make it to Wilhelm's Arena, still level 17, but undeterred. I do have an idea. Remember how I was theorizing that I might be able to kill Wilhelm if I just kept the normal shield surveyors alive? My idea is to stay in the little nook by the fast travel station and continually summon Deathtrap inside of this wall. For some reason, when we do this, it seems like Deathtrap prefers to target Wilhelm rather than the surveyors or the other bots. After 8 minutes of hiding in this corner later, Wilhelm is dead. We grab the power core and plug that sucker in, dooming a large portion of Sanctuary's population. Lilith phases the city, and we're on our way to the Highlands. The run to the Glutinous Thresher is fairly uneventful as Deathtrap draws the attention of most enemies. When we do reach the Glutinous Thresher, we're unfortunately faced with the reality that Deathtrap is completely incapable of determining which enemies can be meleeed and which cannot. And as a result, this will be yet another boss that Deathtrap will try to kill with ranged attacks, despite it being very reasonable to melee. Thankfully, the other Hyperion loaders in the area are capable of damaging the Glutinous Jimbo, so it only takes a few summons of Deathtrap to bring it down and get the beacon. We set up the beacon and let Deathtrap do his thing. Once his duration is finished, there's really nothing we can do to stave off the mechanical hordes, so I instead opt to just sit behind the beacon and repair it until Deathtrap is back online. This is one of the few sections of the game where Deathtrap actually performs somewhat okay. Things aren't focused on him, and he can actually recognize them as melee targets, so he's free to wail on enemies to his heart's content, or at least until something actually starts shooting at him. Thankfully, there's no real way to fail this mission, so it's only a matter of time before the fast travel station lands and we can head to Sanctuary. We check in with Roland and he immediately sends us to do some errands in the Wildlife Exploitation Preserve. Before we do that, we're going to need even more XP. And luckily for us, a brand new batch of missions just became available. The first we do is the Good, the Bad, and the Mordecai, for its unique mission reward, Moxie's Endowment. Oh hey, Aliuta. Moxie's Endowment gives us a small 5.4% XP bonus, which should just barely make the level grinding process easier, especially if I ever go back to the peak or fight for Sanctuary. Next, I wanted to test something. I insert my tip into Moxie's jar, and she gives me her bad touch in return. At the time, I wasn't sure how Moxie weapons handle Deathtrap's damage, but I'm here to report that Deathtrap's damage is not considered your own when it comes to lifesteal. So, I do the mission Mighty Morphin just until I reach level 19, then head back to Sanctuary to think about what my next plan should be. In the end, I decided on heading to the Captain Scarlet DLC. Everything in this DLC will be scaled to my level, providing appropriate XP rewards and items for taking down the next few challenges. We clear the town of Oasis, and I take some time before fighting Nobeer to respec my skill points. I decided to go primarily down the Little Big Trouble tree, investing into the skill Shockstorm, which creates an area of effect damage cloud of electricity when Deathtrap kills an enemy. Nobeard goes down, and we do not get a stink pot. Shade then introduces himself and says we can use his sand skiff to meet the titular Captain Scarlet. The skiff blows up, and we now have to speak with Ms. Blavis, Jennifer, Jocko, and oh, Hayline. Deathtrap shocks the Shandborn Queen, and we get the final part needed to rebuild the sand skiff. We rebuild the sand skiff and spawn it, only to get out of it and hoof it to Scarlet's ship in Wormwater. Upon reaching the ship, we get turned into a fine meat sauce on the pavement, and need to run back. These skiffs have a similar issue to the bandit technicals we fought earlier, where Deathtrap appears to believe he can fight these vehicles with fisticuffs, and as far as I know, you cannot manipulate these skiffs into completely stopping. What you can do, however, is spec into the stair, which does work on sand skiffs. By spending about 5 minutes here on this rock and summoning Deathtrap over and over again, we fend off the attackers and climb up the ship to meet Captain Scarlet. Scarlet gives us the rundown on the treasure of the sands, and sends us off to kill Sandman. Upon getting to Hater's Folly, I opt to run past most of the enemies and summon Deathtrap just before the Sandman trigger. This goes less than well, as when we gain control, Deathtrap is on cooldown and I need to sit behind cover for another minute. Even worse, after summoning him, Deathtrap gets utterly bodied, and we follow soon after. Second tries the charm though, and we're at least able to kill Sandman before biting the dust. Now we just need to take care of Big Sleep before he does the same to us. With the two head honchos down, we grab the second piece of the compass and learn where the third piece is. Hyperion's convoy is easy to deal with. We just need to open the chest and grab the compass piece, then save and quit whenever we're finished looting. We turn in the quest to Scarlet and start heading toward Herbert's place, realize we forgot the present, go back to grab it, then head to Herbert's place for real. In the Rust Yard, we have to wait for Deathtrap to deal with a handful of goons before we're able to pass this gate. But other than that, the run to Herbert is fairly uneventful. Herbert tasks us with the great quest of going to collect the 4 Lord Souls so that we can enter the Kiln of the First Flame. On the way to grab the third one, Deathtrap gets some kills and brings us to level 20. We grab the last tape and return to Herbert, who tells us that the last compass piece is in this chest. Deathtrap can't target it, and we can't melee it. I go around looking for a gun because it's kinda dumb to just stop here, return, and shoot it open. Unsurprisingly, the rocket launcher damages the last piece of the compass, and we now need to go to the Washburn refinery to yada yada yada, you know the deal. I die a couple of times in this area where you need to kill some hordes of loaders in order to progress, since Deathtrap still can't really fend for himself. In Hurley's arena, it takes quite a while to summon Deathtrap enough times to kill the 2 badass loaders necessary to spawn the Trebuchet Terror. During the fight, Deathtrap apparently grows fond of Hurley and refuses to continue fighting him. At least until we summon him again. We grab the last piece of Polly Crichton, head back to Herbert, give him his ever-important gift, and return to Scarlet to assemble the compass. Now, at this point, I could go and finish the DLC, but I think I've amassed enough levels to continue on with the main quest. So, I travel to the Highlands and hoof it to the Preserve. At the gate to the Preserve, we encounter a very cool and fun issue where Deathtrap doesn't really understand the whole leave them alive thing. So unfortunately, we have to kill all of the loaders and get the alternate dialogue from Mordecai. The next roadblock we face is this door that leads to Bloodwing's holding cell. Again, we're forced to wait for Deathtrap to clear out enemies while we jerk off in the corner. After the super badass loader is dead, we don't head directly to Bloodwing's holding cell, but instead make use of the loot midget spawns next to it by having the mission Doctor's Orders active. 4 midgets later, we grab the feather in Bloodwing's enclosure and start moving towards the observation wing. The last door before the boss fight is relatively easy, as it's mostly just low health skags, meaning the skill Upshot Robot gets its chance to shine. Bloodwing herself is actually a really easy fight, particularly due to Deathtrap's ranged attack always hitting, but also because Bloodwing is just generally not a fight that puts too much pressure on the player to begin with. That being said, Bloodwing's electricity phase is a massive test of patience, due to the innate resistance to Deathtrap's ranged attack. Even so, it only takes a few minutes before the bird is grounded and we can grab the Claptrap upgrade. After delivering the upgrade and turning in the mission, I head back to the Exploitation Preserve. I've got a couple of goals here, one of which is XP, obviously, but I'm also looking for loot. By entering the Creature Slaughter Dome and leaving it, we can save and quit to respawn there. From that travel point, we're close to both the spawn point for Pomone and Toomba, and are a short walk from the loot midgets. From Pomone, I'm hoping to find a legendary shield called the Transformer, which transforms shock damage taken into shields, which could be very useful in the coming fights if we can get one. There is one big hiccup here, however, in that Pomone and Toomba are rare spawns, and not guaranteed each time we load in. The loot midgets, on the other hand, are mostly for experience. In our first run, we get a Stabbinker Blaster. Our second run sees our first encounter with Pomone and Toomba, and while Deathtrap can handle Toomba, Pomone simply moves too fast to keep up with. So I run back to Sanctuary and see if speccing into the skill Explosive Clap will help. Explosive Clap is another augment skill that allows Deathtrap to cause an explosion centered on himself. I was expecting it to be fairly useless, but it turns out Explosive Clap is actually pretty powerful in normal mode, one-shotting most basic enemies. In our third run, Deathtrap decides he doesn't want to fight midgets, so I'm stuck kiting this combat engineer until he comes back. Oh, and we hit level 22. While we didn't get the shield I was hoping for, or any other great loot, level 22 should be enough to get through the next story mission without too much issue. So, off to Thousand Cuts. The fight with Brick's men is very easy since we can just sit up by Brick and wait for Deathtrap to deal with everything. When enemies spawn up top, we can jump on this beam and stay out of sight, keeping us safe. We finish off the last of the slabs and... Brick? Brick, you good? Thankfully, it only takes a save and quit to fix Brick, and get to the mortar assault. Brick volunteers to handle the beacons himself, so all Deathtrap has to do is deal with the loaders. With the last beacon down, Brick and Deathtrap can double team the badass loader easily, finishing yet another story mission. After one more run at the preserve to try and get a transformer, I fast travel over to the highlands and run to Opportunity. This part is just frustrating, as there is actually no reason for Deathtrap not to recognize the body double as a melee target, and yet he doesn't and opts to use the ranged shock attack. It's not too bad though. It only takes one summon for Deathtrap to kill the body double. We run through Opportunity, grabbing all the different voice clips, then travel back to Sanctuary to turn in the mission. Before taking on the bunker, I decide to go to the Natural Selection Annex and do the Creature Slaughter Dome, and go from level 22 to level 24, which is exactly the level I need to be. Now we reach the funny turrets. For the uninitiated, these two Hyperion turrets are notoriously bugged, and just don't take damage from a multitude of sources, including Deathtrap. This falls into the Deathtrap can't damage clause I put in the rules, so we melee them and move on to the badass constructor. Instead of letting the badass constructor nuke itself to death, I summon Deathtrap to zap him, which takes quite a while, but we get there eventually. Onto the bunker, we first have to deal with the auto cannons around the arena before B and K3R will spawn. This is kind of an issue, as Deathtrap very easily gets distracted and will usually chase down other loaders rather than focusing on the cannons. And, of course, Deathtrap can't melee the auto cannons, he has to zap them. This part is painful, and it takes 30 minutes from entering the arena to kill the last autocannon and start the boss fight. Comparatively, Bunker is much easier. The only annoying part is needing to sync up Bunker's flight patterns with Deathtrap's summons, but it's not too bad, taking only 23 minutes to kill. We pass the voice check, take the elevator down, and enter Control Core Angel. Now, it shouldn't be a surprise, but the iridium injectors in this room cannot be targeted by Deathtrap. For some reason, I decide to throw a grenade at them to start the fight in this room rather than meleeing, but it's whatever. This fight was the primary reason that I wanted the Transformer. There are more than a couple enemies that deal shock damage, and having the ability to absorb that alongside the ammo absorbing property would have made this section much easier. Alas, here we are. Deathtrap doesn't fare too well in this section since all of the enemies have armored health bars and deal ranged damage. He dies way too fast and can't deal nearly enough damage to keep up. One of the few silver linings in this is actually Explosive Clap, which can damage the shock field generators even though Deathtrap can't normally target them. However, that's about the only grace we'll be receiving here. From start to finish, Control Core Angel took 38 minutes. Instead of watching the cutscene, I saved myself some time by saving and quitting to spawn directly in Marcus's star room, and run to turn in the mission to Mordecai. Next, we head to the Iridium Light, trigger the bridge raising, and run to Sawtooth Cauldron. After hitting the button to go up the elevator, the 4 ambush commanders spawn. They're basically badass nomads and have the health and damage to match. I end up sitting back behind the elevator, summoning Deathtrap to get a few hits in, watching him die, and waiting 50 seconds to repeat the cycle all over again. Not too long after the first ambush commander falls, the second follows suit, then the third, and fourth. Instead of running through Sawtooth Cauldron to get Mortar's buzzard, I do a little grenade jump here to save some time. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't actually check to see if Deathtrap could target Boombringer. I'm pretty sure he can't, so I just threw some grenades at it, but if I'm wrong, let me know in the comments. Usually I'm pretty good about checking this stuff, but sometimes things like this get through. We strafe past Mortar, take the elevator up, and wait for Deathtrap to come off cooldown so we can destroy the buzzards. This is another part that took several minutes and multiple cooldowns of Deathtrap because of how little damage the ranged shock attack does. A few minutes later, we mark all of the packages of Y94 Odomo charges and head back to the Iridium Blight so we can finally get to the Arid Nexus. In the Boneyard, I noticed something alarming. The items in the vending machines are all at least level 27, which means this area is also at least level 27. And we're level 25. To remedy this, I head over to the Dust and let Deathtrap go hog wild on the spider ants and bandits, along with Moobert and Goobert. It doesn't take long for us to hit level 26, and after a couple more runs, I decide I'd like a change of scenery, so I head through the Sanctuary Hole and get to the Caustic Caverns. Unfortunately, I get my shit pushed in the Caustic Caverns, so instead of dealing with that, I go back to the Dust. Perhaps a change of scenery is not always nice. We hit level 27, and I take some time to respec. Most of my skill points go into Best Friends Forever for survivability, Upshot Robot, and Explosive Clap, but I also throw some points into Little Big Trouble for Meilin and Strength of 5 Gorillas. Back to the Boneyard, I hit the ladder trigger and head to the first pumping station. Here's something fun for those who have never seen it before. You can walk directly through these rocks here, continue walking along this cliffside in the void, and eventually die while getting flung back inbounds. This doesn't have any practical application, as far as I know, but it's a funny little thing. We hit the pumping station next to the fast travel, then the underground pumping station, and ram the pipe with the Goon Mobile. In the Badlands, there isn't really any required fighting, which bodes well for us. I activate the elevator next to Saturn, then do a grenade jump to get straight into the info stockade. We grab the location of the warrior and head back to Sanctuary. Here we are, the final mission of the game. Before talking to Claptrap, I go see what all the other characters have to offer in case it's an upgrade to what I currently have. Then I talk to Claptrap and head back to the Dust. We're still a couple levels underleveled, and considering the primary enemy in the final mission is loaders, it'd be a very bad idea to walk in before preparing. After hitting level 28, I figure I'm close enough to finishing the game off, so I head to the Iridium Blight. Surprisingly, the doors section isn't the CBT I was expecting, since all of the enemies were level 27, but it still took a good amount of time to clear all the waves of loaders. In Heroes Pass, I elect to perform the normal skip by making this jump across the chasm, and performing this grenade jump past the second barrier, allowing me to run directly to the Vault of the Warrior. Now it's time for the fun part. Pop quiz. What will Deathtrap do when I summon him? A. Melee Handsome Jack. B. Melee Jack's clones. C. Melee both. Or D. Melee neither. If you guessed B, congratulations, you figured out why I have a hernia. It's at this point in the run where I have to seriously question if anyone even bothered to test Deathtrap while developing Gage. Seriously, tell me, why is it that Deathtrap is completely incapable of fighting nearly every boss in the game with melee? To make matters worse, Jack is level 32. Meaning it's going to take a while before Deathtrap is able to get to the gooey center of that Tootsie Pop. At one point in the fight, Jack's invincibility shield bugged, and I had to save and quit in order to progress. In the end, the thing that made this fight doable was manipulating Jack's AI to stand still whenever I could, which eventually he just started doing on his own. With Jack defeated, there's only one enemy left to deal with. Now I'm going to shoot straight with you on this. I gave fighting the warrior head on a couple tries, and it was not happening. I was just taking too much damage and couldn't survive any of the massive AoE attacks. Fortunately for me, there is another way. By walking up these rocks and performing some tricky jumps, you can get on top of this massive shield that normally blocks you from shooting the warrior outside of the arena. This lets me sit in a safe spot and turns this horribly perilous fight into one that is possible to beat at my current level. That's not to say it was free though. Whenever the warrior dives under the lava, his tail will hit the ground 3 times. Each time this happens, it's possible to get knocked down and suddenly you're back into the frying pan. I was pretty close to taking out the warrior, but overcompensated for the knockback from the tail, and ended up falling off of the shield. I did my best to finish off the warrior from there, but got crushed while Deathtrap was on cooldown and had to restart from the beginning. It took a long time to get to that point, so this was heartbreaking. This next time I made sure to pay more attention, didn't overcompensate for the tail knockback, and just prayed no shenanigans would happen. 31 minutes later, and the warrior was in his death phase, literally just waiting to be killed. I ran out into the arena and summoned Deathtrap one last time. Deathtrap dealt the finishing blow to the warrior, then to Handsome Jack. While this run wasn't very interesting to play, it really revealed a lot to me about what are perhaps some of the most egregious issues with Deathtrap as an action skill. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge a common complaint with some of my previous Borderlands 2 runs, mainly XP farming as an easy way out. Frankly, while I do respect those who spend extra time to do challenges on UVHM or OP10, I just don't like the idea of being potentially trapped without overleveling as an option. I enjoy doing these runs from a fresh file because I can take it easy, go at my own pace, and decide where my own limits lie. Plus, I think if I were to do a run like this on UVHM, I may as well just do every character's action skill only, and that's not gonna happen. It'd take way too long to... Who the hell are you guys? From every foot job. Oh hey, I guess we're back here, huh? Well, it doesn't really make sense to go over every little detail of the game for every character, so how about we do something different? I'll go through the game bit by bit, and we'll talk about how each character fared, their relative strengths and weaknesses, and come up with a tier list at the end. Sound good? Before we do that though, let's go over each class's restrictions and starting items, and talk a little bit about why I made those choices. First things first, pretty much every class except for Salvador gets at least one bone of the Ancients. Maya gets all of them since her action skill does all elements, but the reasoning here is very simple. I really don't like having all of my damage being on a cooldown. It's one thing if you're playing a MOBA, and your big, good ability takes 12 seconds to recharge. Usually you have at least something to do as filler in between. But when the only thing you can meaningfully do takes more than a few seconds to come online, it can get really grating really fast. Next, most classes, except for Salvador and Zero, got legendary class mods. Admittedly, this probably wasn't necessary. The main reason I did this is to give myself the best shot at completing the game. But there were some cases where I realized later on that some blue class mods just boosted better or more relevant skills than the legendary ones. So that's on me for not doing my research. Axton, Maya, Zero, and Gage all got roughly the same selection of shields. The Rough Rider and Blockade. Krieg only gets the Rough Rider, and Gage gets the Love Thumper and Hide of Terra for her Sharing is Caring skill. Lastly, I had a soft rule in place for all characters where I'd just try to get by without using slag nades if it seemed doable. But as a spoiler, slag is usually necessary for UVHM. Now onto the specific restrictions. Axton is not allowed to shoot or melee unless his turrets are incapable of targeting or damaging something. This one should be pretty obvious, we pretty much just went through this in the main playthrough. The same thing goes for Maya, Zero, and Gage. Gage gets the privilege of being able to hold the basic repeater in order to get healing from cooking up trouble. Krieg can only melee and throw buzz axes during Buzz Axe Rampage, and I also gave him Light the Fuse to make it so that going down wasn't certain death. Salvador can only fire the weapon in his left hand, and for those at home, that means he can only shoot while gun zerking. But Salvador, being who he is, means he has to scavenge all of his own gear and gets none to start with. I also allowed him to throw grenades, but only while gun zerking because of the double your fun skill. So, with that all out of the way, where do we start? Since these characters are all UVHM, they all start at cleaning up the burg. I use this mission to more or less get my bearings, try to get a feel for how the rest of the challenge would play out. Salvador had to spend some time in the beginning going to the Digistruct Peak to find some weapons and other trinkets, but was good to go after finding this purple Hyperion shotgun. Pretty much nobody has issues with this portion of the game, with the exception of Gage. Gage was the last character I played through in this, and so I was painfully aware how much slag was going to be necessary if I wanted to make any progress. Even with a slag transfusion grenade, it took multiple minutes to handle all of the various enemies in Liarsburg. This does not bode well. Moving on to Boom Boom, I spent some time with Axton trying to mess around with my skills, and seeing what I could do to make the Sabri turrets outdamage the health regeneration these particular bosses get from UVHM. In the end, I settled with using a slag bouncing Betty rather than using double up, though later on I revert this choice. For Maya, things were not looking good. On the run up to Boom Boom, I was having lots of trouble dealing with the damage resistances of ironclad psychos, and as it turns out, Boom and Boom are also both armored enemies. Who knew? Maya's damage from phase lock only barely managed to outdo the UVHM health regeneration, so it took upwards of 20 minutes to actually deal the finishing blow. Salvador being Salvador, he just needs some slag and Boom goes down like a sack of potatoes, with Boom following shortly after. In a pretty big surprise to me, Zero actually had very little issue with Boom Boom. I never really used the skill Unforeseen before, but boosting it to 11 points with the tricky spy class mod and applying Deathmark with kunai meant it could deal sizable chunks of damage. I'm not sure if ambush also is making a difference here, since a lot of Zero's skills have weird interactions. Krieg was much like Salvador, except he didn't even need slag to absolutely decimate the Blowjob brothers. And lastly, Gage. Deathtrap on his own deals practically negative damage, so I elected to equip the Love Thumper for this fight, not realizing what should have been the obvious implication of that. You see, the Love Thumper has a very fun mechanic where the novas you get from meleeing enemies also deal damage to allies. This is annoying in multiplayer, but is a decent point of balance for what is one of the best roid shields in the game. For Gage, however, this shield turns Deathtrap into more of a literal version of himself. And if you're not careful, he will down you. All that being said, it doesn't take too long before we can finally kill Boom and move on to the next challenge. To start, Axton doesn't have too many issues with Captain Flint, but in order to not deal with the many enemies in the arena, I utilize the small nook you enter from to lure Flint over and give myself time to chill while I wait for my Sabre turrets to recharge. With this, it takes only a couple minutes for Flint to blaze his last trail. Zero died a couple of times trying to take care of Flint, but that was definitely a skill issue on my part. I was trying to just run at Flint and throw the hologram at him for shock damage, paying little attention to the other enemies in the arena. As soon as I realized I'd need to lure Flint further away from his goons and be more mindful of things like cover, the fight was a piece of cake. Thankfully for Gage, Captain Flint is one of the only bosses in the game Deathtrap can melee, so just by applying some slag and letting Deathtrap do his thing, we are golden. At some point, Salvador found a Jacob shotgun, and by having it in our main hand, Salvador transfers the innate 50% critical hit damage bonus to his offhand, and gets the bonus gun damage from Divergent Likeness. Stacking these bonuses, along with slag, luring Flint over to the starting area, and getting a fat money shot all over his dumb face, lets Salvador also pass with ease. Krieg enters the fight, face tanks to get Salt the Wound stacks and get in Rage of Release the Beast, then kills Flint in record time. Oh hey, a Thunderball Fists. Now, one character really struggled with Captain Flint. Maya simply could not outdamage Captain Flint's health regeneration. I spent a long time thinking about how I could possibly get around this, what skills I can employ to deal more damage, what items I could quote-unquote farm, give myself, to even have a chance to take on Flint. I even did some runs to Flint where I spec'd into skills that were dubiously in the spirit of the challenge to see if that made a difference. After a while, I realized there was probably information out there which could help me out. Something I just didn't know, so I asked the Borderlands modding Discord server for advice. As it turns out, badass enemies like Captain Flint aren't even supposed to have health regeneration in UVHM until you go into overpowered levels. But when the Fight for Sanctuary DLC was released, the levels where badass enemies would regen health didn't get adjusted to account for the increased maximum level of 80. And as a result, at level 73 and up, badass enemies will regenerate health. When I learned about this, I was floored. This is obviously an oversight by Gearbox. Now, this gives me a few options for how I want to proceed with Maya. In reality, it probably is possible to kill Flint at level 80, with some extraordinary luck and some setup that'd take hours upon hours to perfect. But after running at Flint face first for about an hour, it just didn't seem reasonable. So instead, I came to the conclusion that if Fight for Sanctuary broke this mechanic, I'd just uninstall it. With Fight for Sanctuary uninstalled, the max level was now level 72, and badass enemies would no longer regenerate health. If you don't like this course of action, tough, because Maya is not the only character that gets this treatment. I run up to Captain Flint, equip the Splatter Witch class mod, and the Corrosive Bone of the Ancients, then went back to my safe little cubby. It took about 10 minutes of continuously phase locking Captain Flint before Maya could finally continue along with the rest of the cast. It'll be a while before these 6 find their next real challenge, so let's talk mechanics for a bit. UVHM health regeneration isn't just based on whether an enemy is badass or not. There's also an additional check to see if the enemy has a max health multiplier greater than 40. This is the reason why some enemies which are not badasses also don't regenerate health in UVHM. This part is hardly even worth mentioning, but it is a whole story mission, so we may as well take a peek. Axton, perhaps unsurprisingly, got by pretty easily in this section. The basic strategy I employed was standing on something tall while waiting for the turrets to come off cooldown and let the psychos and marauders spend their time chasing Lilith. Krieg did Krieg things, taking damage, releasing the beast, and subsequently blood-sploding everything that even looked at him sideways. Salvador spent some time in Sanctuary schmoozing Moxie and was able to get a bad touch, along with a slag weapon to switch to in his offhand. I also spent some time trying to refine my build, focusing on balancing the 3 pillars of survivability, damage, and staying in Gunzerk. As a result, clearing the various enemies is a breeze. Surprisingly, Maya didn't have too much issue in this section. Subsequence pairs really well with Ruin and Convergence, since each time a new enemy is phase locked, it reapplies the elemental damage and pulls all enemies in. You can set up some pretty sick phase lock chains if you have a bunch of low health enemies all grouped together. Since we were playing at level 72 for Maya as well, the badasses didn't pose too much of a threat. Zero died once in his romp with Lilith, though again this was purely a skill issue on my part. With liberal applications of slag and carefully ensuring enemies were marked for death when unforeseen goes off, we make it through just fine. And finally, Gage. With no bosses or flying enemies, Deathtrap actually fares pretty well in this section. The only hang up is when Deathtrap goes on cooldown. Even with the 10 points in 20% cooler and the legendary Roboteer class mod, Gage has one of the longest action skill cooldowns in the game, second only to the character who regenerates his skill by taking damage. Even so, Gage only dies once in this section and we can move on to the next hurdle. What hurdle would that be? Oh, I'm glad you asked. Warden was, from what I could tell, the big filter of this run. You could tell pretty easily how good an action skill was for damage based on how it performed in the Warden fight. And while it took me a few tries to figure out a worthwhile strategy with Axton, when I did, it was smooth sailing from there on out, and we did the damage that needed getting done. Salvador had a bit of a detour before going to kill Warden. Over in the land of Oasis, there is a shotgun that works particularly well in the offhand of Salvador, and I figured it might save some time later on if I spend the time now to get it. So I played through the Captain Scarlet DLC until I could get the message in a bottle mission that correlates with the unique Jacob shotgun, the Orphan Maker. In particular, I was looking for a 3-mag, 4-pellet Orphan Maker. That might not sound crazy, but keep in mind, this took me 20 minutes to play through until I got into a good farming position for the shotgun. But it took 2 hours before I got the parts I wanted. So, what's the upshot from this? Well, Salvador walks up to Warden and nearly kills him in a single shot. Krieg has a similar experience to Salvador, just without the hours of setup. Really, it was so short I don't think I could elucidate it properly in words. Zero was in a similar boat to Axton, where it took some careful thought and execution, but after realizing which character I was playing, it was only a matter of using positioning and timing to my advantage so I could survive until I dealt the final blow to Warden. Now let's talk about the 2 characters who didn't kill Warden on the Bloodshot Ramparts. Admittedly, I was not hopeful for Maya or Gage to be able to kill Warden based on their performance on previous bosses. Maya simply doesn't do enough damage, and Deathtrap can't even melee Warden. So, for Maya, I went to the friendship gulag, and my entire strategy was to hide behind this shipping container, peeking out whenever phase lock was off of cooldown, then ducking back in to stay safe. I found the legendary binder was better than the witch class mod here, since the majority of my damage was coming from the phase lock itself and not the corrosive damage. It took a while, but Maya was able to kill Warden. Gage, on the other hand, had to deal with a monumental task. Gage did not have the luxury of consistent damage like Maya, as Deathtrap was prone to just getting distracted by enemies. As a result, the amount of damage Deathtrap did per summon was far less on average compared to Maya. I tried to face this seemingly impassable wall for as long as I could head on, only to die many deaths. However, I eventually remembered something. Back in my starter pistol only run, I grenade jumped on top of the collision that Warden normally has because Roland bugged out. I didn't show it in the video, but I also figured out that it's very easy to get out of bounds in this area with a simple grenade jump, and there's tons of collision for you to stand on. Using this knowledge, I grenade jumped out of bounds and found a piece of collision where I could stand, summon Deathtrap, and wait. This took an uncomfortably long amount of time, in no small part because I couldn't see Warden's health. I just had to hope that it'd die eventually. And thankfully for me, after about an hour, he did exactly that. With the Warden destroyed, we can move on to the next big boss. In fact, the first boss with a boss health bar. Let's be real. This fight can easily be just as bad, if not worse, than Warden, and that should have been made clear in the normal mode playthrough. Axton walks into the arena and has a distinct advantage since the Sabre turret seems to always focus fire on Wilhelm. Unlike some poor souls, Axton doesn't have to play the lottery to get his action skill to do the thing he actually wants it to do. It just does. The product of this actually good AI is a single death to negligence, but a victory shortly after. After Maya's less than stellar performance with Warden, I wasn't too excited to see how the Wilhelm fight would go. Fortunately for us, however, Maya also has an advantage in this fight, in the fact that she can take out the Surveyor bot's Wilhelm spawns very consistently. With shield regen not being an issue, it was only a matter of time, and not dying to poor positioning, before Maya dealt the finishing blow. Zero, so far, has been performing better than expected, but his fight with Wilhelm truly highlighted just how powerful Unforeseen is. After dying only once, Zero was able to defeat Wilhelm in 2 minutes flat, roughly a quarter of Axton and Maya's 8-ish minute kills. Even writing the script now, this seems insane. Salvador, rocking the same build he had with Warden, waltzed into Wilhelm's arena, unopposed and cheerful, slagged Wilhelm, got his kill skills, and took out 3/4 of his health bar. The only reason the fight didn't end in seconds was because I walked in while gunzerking and ran out midway through. Even though his kill wasn't as fast as Salvador's, Krieg's definitely came very close. Despite not using slag, Krieg made Wilhelm scream in just under 50 seconds with minimal setup, and I will take that setup time into account when making my final tier list. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Gage. You know, for some reason, when I started the UVHM playthrough of Gage, I had it in my mind it would somehow be easier than the normal mode playthrough. Like the extra skill points and gear I had would magically erase all of the issues Deathtrap had, and suddenly she'd be less than the biggest pain in the ass. Indeed, UVHM is easier in some ways, but in others, the ball ache increases tenfold. The main issue is yet again the repair surveyors. If Wilhelm spawns any, Deathtrap simply cannot outdamage the health and shield regeneration from both kinds of surveyors, and makes the fight nearly impossible. The only saving grace in UVHM is that there is a glitch where shield surveyors will visually leash to Wilhelm, but won't actually provide any shield regeneration. On top of that, I found that in this spot on top of the train car that Wilhelm throws when you first enter the area, you're relatively safe, and unless Wilhelm uses his ranged shock attack, you can simply sit here and summon Deathtrap over and over again. Make no mistake, this took hours to figure out, and many multiple minutes afterwards were spent getting the final kill. It'll be another bit before we hit our next challenge, so I wanted to take a moment to talk about something that really bothered me while I was doing these runs. Borderlands 2's action skill cooldowns are usually pretty well balanced. More powerful action skills have longer cooldowns, like Salvador's Gunzerk having a 42-second cooldown, while more integral and balanced action skills have a shorter cooldown, like Maya's Phase Lock at 13 seconds. Then you have Deathtrap. For some reason, Deathtrap has the second longest cooldown in the entire game, only losing out to Krieg's Buzzax Rampage, which gets naturally regenerated when Krieg takes health damage. There really is no good reason for Deathtrap to not just be permanently active and only go on some kind of cooldown when he dies, in my opinion. But maybe it's a bit late to be requesting balance changes for this game. Starting again with Axton as our baseline, Bloodwing really isn't that threatening of a boss. There are two attacks that Bloodwing can do to really put you in danger. The first of which is her breath attack, which pretty much always applies a damage over time effect if you're caught in it. And the other is the large AoE attack she unleashes. Neither of these are particularly difficult to dodge unless you find yourself distracted by the skags that spawn in the arena. Thankfully, Axton's turrets deal enough damage and draw enough aggro to make all of these potential issues moot, and he nabs the Claptrap upgrade with no issues. Maya had a few more issues due to her inferior DPS, but still held an advantage when it came to handling the skags from her various crowd control skills. This, combined with the very consistent and low cooldown phase lock, means the fight goes relatively smoothly, and she too gets her upgrade. If there was any fight Zero would struggle with, it'd be this one. Given that Unforeseen basically turns Zero's hologram into a grenade with a 6-second fuse time, it really shouldn't be any surprise that this was one of the more tedious fights, even if it wasn't difficult per se. While Bloodwing is airborne, the only real method of dealing damage you have is kunai, which have a very slow projectile speed and are not very accurate. However, when Bloodwing is grounded, it's much more reasonable to use Unforeseen to deal large chunks of damage. Again, this fight may be tedious for Zero, but it's definitely not difficult. Zero secures the kill with a time comparable to Axton. And we're going to ignore the fact that I accidentally pressed my quit without saving keybind after killing Bloodwing and needed to do the fight a second time as Zero. Krieg is another character you might expect to have some trouble with Bloodwing, but there's a pretty cool thing about Borderlands 2 that a lot of people who play melee builds utilize while fighting flying enemies, and that is the infinite vertical range of melee attacks. Basically, melee attacks extend upward to virtually any enemy you might care to hit, so long as you're under the enemy when you hit it. And this makes Krieg's fight with Bloodwing no harder than any other non-flying enemy. As far as the easiest kill goes, there really isn't any contest. It does take a bit of setup to get the kill skills necessary to deal the extreme damage Salvador is capable of, but once you do the absolute bare minimum, the dividends are unmatched. And finally, the third longest fight in this series of playthroughs, Gage versus Bloodwing. In the normal mode run, I already highlighted some of the main gripes I had with this matchup, but UVHM introduces a whole other level of ass fuckery, which manifests in the form of the Shock Yacker. You might know that when Bloodwing does her AoE attacks, she elementally charges any skags that are near her, similar to the elemental badass variants you see across Pandora. Of these, the shock elemental versions of Skags are the most brutal. Not only do they have increased movement and attack speed, there's also the existence of the shock yacker, created from a barf skag. This thing will ruin your day if you're unlucky. And since we're fighting Bloodwing for what is realistically hours for a single kill, it's more than likely we'll encounter at least a couple of these affronts to video game design. I spent quite a while seeing if there was some way I could potentially cheese Bloodwing the same way I did with Warden, but to no avail. Any out of bounds spot I could find was either not completely safe or hit a trigger that made Bloodwing's health replenish fully. In the end, I bit the bullet and toughed the fight out. The final attempt that killed the bird took nearly a whole hour. Again, that's not counting all of the failed attempts, all of the time spent trying to cheese. That's just how long it took to kill Bloodwing once. But we did it. Good lord, did we do it. Wait, really? Jack's body double? Is this even worth including? See, Axton kills the body double pretty easily after a couple of tries. Maya doesn't even die once. Zero one-shots him. Who could have possibly had trouble with... Oh no. So this section purely exists to discuss the one true roadblock Gage had. In every other fight, there is a mostly reasonable way that Gage can succeed. Either by cheese, gear, or pure brute force. There is something you can do as Gage to progress. Handsome Jack's body double is the exception to this. I could not find a reasonable way to make Deathtrap deal enough damage to kill Jack's body double. That's not to say a way doesn't exist. In fact, I'm pretty sure that with enough luck and patience, you could use something like the Love Thumper Novas to kill the body double. But after a good while of trying different things, the one thing that killed my chances was the body double's health regeneration. Like Captain Flint, Handsome Jack's body double gains health regeneration in UVHM after level 72. So, for the second time in this challenge run, I uninstalled the Fight for Sanctuary DLC and returned to a level 72 world. After this, the fight wasn't trivial, but I also wouldn't classify it as challenging either. If this is underwhelming to you, I will admit I am not a fan of this either. This one oversight by the developers is really a pain in the ass, and makes the difference between the game being practically impossible or pretty lukewarm, and I really would have preferred if there was some middle ground. Really, the big problem here isn't even that, it's Deathtrap's ability to actually fight important enemies, but I won't beleaguer that point any further. When you first enter into Bunker's arena, there's a few autocannons you need to destroy first before getting into the fight proper. Axton has some trouble with this, primarily because the Sabra turrets seem to prioritize the various loaders over the autocannons themselves. It's not a huge issue, since it takes only one activation where the turrets lock onto the autocannons to actually kill them. The bunker fight itself is pretty uneventful, only taking 8 minutes to bring down. Maya has fewer issues with the autocannons, given that she can actually aim her action skill, but takes nearly twice as long to kill the bunker itself at 14 whole minutes. Even so, not a very tough fight, and she moves on. With Zero, I did 2 kills on Bunker, just for funsies, one with Boar, and another with the normal rules. Zero had a lot of the same issues with Bunker that he did with Bloodwing, mainly in needing to wait for Bunker to be in a good position to hit. When Bunker did get in a good position, however, Unforeseen did a decent chunk of damage. However, some unlucky movement patterns meant that Zero's Bunker kill took a little longer than Axton's at 10 minutes. Krieg's worst matchup in this playthrough was probably Bunker. Because Bunker doesn't fly overhead much and tends to sway back and forth quite far away from the arena, Krieg needs to use his thrown buzz axes to deal damage. This isn't the worst thing in the world, since you can get them to deal good damage if you take the time to set up your kill skills. and as such, Krieg's kill takes 5 minutes. Now, this has nothing to do with Bunker, but Salvador found an Unforgiven while doing the slab initiation, and I thought that was funny. Anyway, Salvador's fight against Bunker was also very anticlimactic. I didn't really min-max my damage as much as I could have, so I didn't end up with any super crazy nonsense that we saw with earlier bosses. But the kill still only took 2 minutes. Now, remember when I said Bloodwing versus Gage was the 3rd longest fight in all of these playthroughs? Well, you might think the longest for Gage might be Gage against Bunker, or Gage against the Warrior. But I'm here to tell you, the single longest fight in this game was Gage against the autocannons. I'm not joking. It took 4 hours to wrangle Deathtrap to target the cannons and just have enough slag nades to kill them. Might I remind you, it took 1 hour to kill Bloodwing. I actually left the game on overnight after killing the 6th autocannon because when you save and quit, the game doesn't save how many autocannons you've killed. So I just paused, stopped the recording, and went to bed, waking up the next morning and getting right back on the wagon. It took so long that I just started throwing as many slag grenades as I could at the turrets. And if that makes you upset, please consider the following. You are me. You are playing Gage, and you cannot shoot. You've been sitting in the bunker for 3 hours straight, trying to get your action skill to do anything besides run around like a toddler in a Toys R Us. Can you honestly tell me you'd be better in this situation? I'm only humongous, after all. Anyway, after 4 hours of the most mind-numbing gameplay, Bunker finally arrives. And while this fight took slightly longer than the Bloodwing fight, well, let's just say I wasn't exactly paying the most attention during it. The kill took a little over 1 hour and 30 minutes, but if I wasn't preoccupied doing other very important things, it probably would have only taken about 50 minutes. Now, this wouldn't be in the video if it wasn't for the fact that these 5 buzzards at the top of the nest took pretty much every character that wasn't Salvador a very long time to kill. Maya and Krieg didn't have too many issues, only needing about 5 minutes to kill the buzzards, but Axton, Zero, and especially Gage had a very hard time dealing enough damage to a single buzzard to kill it. I just wanted to show that, while I'm only showing the highlights of all these playthroughs, there are various other small challenges that each character needed to overcome in order to progress. Fortunately for us, we're almost done with this video, since the next thing I'll be covering is... Before talking about the warrior itself, let's talk about the fight that precedes it, Handsome Jack. Handsome Jack in challenge runs can actually be a very tough fight. In UVHM, after level 72, he has a pretty damn strong amount of health regeneration, and the various things he can summon can really make the whole affair a much more intense fight than it has any right to be. Axton gets through the fight and moves on to the main course, the warrior. I spent a long time fighting the warrior as Axton, mostly because the damage the Sea-Raw turrets deal aren't that good against him, and there are many huge AoE attacks the warrior can do that are practically instant kills if your action skill isn't active. I considered doing the cheese strat to kill the warrior as Axton, given how long the fight was taking, but ended up respeccing into more survivability and returning to do the fight normally. In the end, it took about 23 minutes for Axton to kill the warrior in his final attempt. After killing Handsome Jack pretty easily, Maya also spent quite a while on the warrior fight. Compared to Axton, Maya simply doesn't have the same survivability, so when things like this happen, you don't have much to lean on. In the end, I did end up doing the cheese strat on Maya, only because I was getting fed up with being trampled on, and frankly just wanted to get to the other characters. Maya's final warrior fight took 28 minutes. Zero had some trouble in the Handsome Jack fight due to the invincibility surveyor, but after taking that out and getting Jack stuck in one of his scripted terminal spots, we took him out fairly easily. Unfortunately for Zero, he also doesn't have much survivability, so he too died a few times and resorted to the cheese strat. Thankfully for him, so long as the warrior was either in the left or right spots, Unforeseen could actually hit, meaning he was able to deal with the final boss in a very respectable 14 minutes, and he even got a flacker for his troubles. Before going to fight the warrior, I decided to do the mission Rackaholics Anonymous as Salvador to get Ruby, another Moxie weapon with slightly higher lifesteal. This didn't make much difference, but it was an upgrade and only took about 10 minutes to grab. Jack himself took a minute since I wanted to see if I could kill him before he summoned his invincibility drone, but since Jack doesn't get slagged easily, I got impatient. The warrior itself was a complete and utter joke. Each time it popped out of the ground, I got my kill skills, slagged it, and did enough damage to force it right back into the lava. Salvador's warrior kill took just over 2 minutes. Krieg ate Jack for breakfast, but when it came to the warrior, things were actually pretty slow. The warrior has a tendency to do big slam attacks when you're close to him, so it's difficult for Krieg to get in and go ham. On top of that, the warrior didn't seem to deal enough damage to consistently get Krieg into release the beast range, so I spent a lot of time waiting for the chrysalisks in the area to safely lower my health. That all being said, Krieg still had a very firm second place standing with a 5-minute warrior fight. And finally, Gage. Like in the normal mode playthrough, Handsome Jack was a huge pain in the ass. And yet again, the culprit is Deathtrap's absolutely dog shit AI. Early in the fight, things are okay. Deathtrap tends to fight the Jack clones instead of the actual one, but that's not a huge deal. The real issue is when his shield goes down and he begins to summon his invincibility surveyor. Deathtrap, no matter what you do, where you summon him, how you position yourself, will almost always decide to target Jack instead of the surveyor, making the fight last 10 times longer than it needs to. After about 2 hours of attempts, Jack did what Jack does best and glitched out, allowing me to get the kill and start the real final fight. Now, instead of doing the cheese strat where I'd been standing on top of the light barrier, I instead decided to do this whole fight standing over on the right side of the arena. This area is fairly safe to stand at, but doesn't give you great visibility on the warrior itself, which isn't as much of a problem when you're using Deathtrap. It took a very long time, being the second longest fight in this, but after an hour and a half, Gage killed the warrior.
Oh my god, thank fucking Christ. I'm so done with this fucking challenge. Jesus fuck.
Of course, in classic Deathtrap fashion, when I summon him to deal the final blow to Jack, he instead decides he'd much prefer to kill some random rack in the arena before doing the thing he actually needs to do. So, now that we've finished action skill only UVHM with every character, where do we stand? What have we learned? And most importantly, where is that tier list I promised? Well, I have to say that Axton is a pretty dang good baseline for this challenge. His turrets aren't terribly strong, and they have issues when it comes to actually shooting the things you want, but when they work pretty dang okay. For all these reasons, I think Axton gets a solid B tier. Next, we have Maya. Maya has the opposite issues that Axton has, where she gets total control over which enemies she damages, but even with that level of control, she simply cannot deal enough damage with only phase lock. I won't put her into the D tier just because she does have a very low cooldown and, again, actually has control over what she damages, but those are very low bars to meet. For that, Maya gets C tier. I've said it once and I'll say it again, Zero performed admirably in his entire playthrough. I was expecting mediocrity and was pleasantly surprised by a somewhat challenging but overall rewarding character that could output very good damage with some careful planning. I don't think many people would argue that Zero belongs in the A tier. Salvador and Krieg both gave me some pause for thought when I was coming up with this tier list. They both have very obvious flaws in how you needed to play them in this challenge. Salvador needing to farm his own gear, and Krieg had the restrictions of being a primarily melee character. However, even with all of that, they're both clearly the most powerful characters in the lot, and I think both deserve S tier. And finally, last and certainly least, Gage. When you think about it, Deathtrap is like a chimera of all the great issues the other Vault Hunter's action skills pose. He's short-ranged, meaning he struggles with ranged matchups. He's not controlled by the player, leading to frustrating moments where he doesn't do what you want. He doesn't deal nearly enough damage in most situations, making every boss take potentially hours. And there's also a pretty big reliance on having the right gear for any particular encounter. Even in normal gameplay, Deathtrap's damage pales in comparison to what you can do as Gage if you stack Anarchy. Deathtrap is easily the worst action skill in the game. And so, Gage goes right into her own tier and is tonight's biggest loser. I hope you enjoyed the video. And even if you didn't, I hope you learned something new. If you have any thoughts or feelings you'd like to share, please do so in the comments. This video has been roughly 6 months in the making, between recording, scripting, and editing, and your support is what makes it all worthwhile. As a final aside, I just wanted to say that a while ago I retired channel memberships. I had my reasons for doing that and I won't go into it here, but if you're curious about it, I did make a post. At some point, I do want to set up something that allows people to support me directly in a financial manner, but I'd prefer if it was something outside of YouTube. If you have any suggestions on that front, feel free to let me know. Anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful day. I come from every foot job. So high, so far to splooge. I jerk 1,000,000 times a day. I only jerk to anime. It's pretty good. I like that.